She is one of the most important women in human history, yet the Bible never speaks her name. She was there when the flood ended, when the ark came to rest upon dry ground and a new chapter for humanity began. She walked off that vessel not as a bystander to her husband's legacy, but as a chosen matriarch, carrying within her the future of an entire continent. She gave birth to Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan, names that would become the cornerstones of some of the greatest civilizations in Africa and the Near East. From her womb came Ethiopia and Egypt, Libya, and the lands of Canaan. Her sons built empires, governed kingdoms, and left an imprint on world history that still endures to this day. And yet, despite her foundational role in the repopulation of the earth and the rise of African civilization, she was written out of the narrative. The scriptures name her sons, but they do not name her. The sacred text records her fruit, but not her face. She remains a ghost in the background of biblical history, not because she was insignificant, but because patriarchal tradition buried her identity beneath the accomplishments of the men she bore. This is not fiction. It is restoration, a sacred memory reclaimed from beneath the weight of historical silence. It is about restoring dignity to a forgotten mother whose legacy shaped the course of nations. This is not the story of a missing name. It is the story of a powerful origin. This is the legacy of Ham's wife, the true mother of the African people. If this story resonates with you, if you believe it's time to restore the voices that history silenced, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this truth with others. And we invite you to leave a comment below. Your voice matters in reclaiming what was lost. The journey begins now. The silence ends here. This is Ham's wife, the mother of the African people. After the great flood had cleansed the earth and the waters withdrew into the deep, the world stood bare and renewed, a canvas awaiting the touch of destiny. From the ark stepped Noah, the chosen survivor of a corrupted age, along with his wife, his sons Shem, Japheth, and Ham, and their respective wives. These 8 individuals carried the weight of humanity's future upon their shoulders, appointed by divine providence to repopulate the earth and reshape civilization in the shadow of judgment and the light of grace. Among the 3 sons of Noah, Ham emerged as a foundational figure in the history of Africa and the ancient Near East. Though later traditions would obscure his legacy, the biblical record in Genesis, chapter 10, the Table of Nations, presents Ham as the father of 4 sons whose names became synonymous with power, culture, and the early empires of the post-flood world. Ham's firstborn, Cush, became the progenitor of the kingdom of Cush, the great Ethiopian and Nubian empires that would rival Egypt in strength and splendor. Mizraim, the second, gave rise to the nation of Egypt, a civilization revered for its monumental architecture, advanced science, and deep spiritual heritage. Phut, the third son, was associated with the peoples of North Africa, especially Libya, who occupied crucial roles in ancient military and mercantile systems. And Canaan, the youngest, fathered the tribes of the Levant, whose land would later become central in the biblical narrative. These 4 sons were not merely historical figures, they were patriarchs of nations whose influence shaped human history. Through them, Ham's bloodline extended across vast territories, into river valleys, deserts, coastlines, and fertile plains where their descendants built cities, developed languages, constructed temples, and established systems of trade, law, and worship that would echo through millennia. And yet, within this extensive record of names, lineages, and the birth of nations, there is one critical omission that cannot be ignored. The biblical text, while naming the sons of Ham with clarity and reverence, offers not a single word about the woman who gave them life, the mother of Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan, the woman who carried them in her womb, raised them from infancy, and shaped their earliest understanding of the world, is never identified. Her name and origin are absent from the record, and her story remains untold, lost in the silence of patriarchal tradition. She remains anonymous in the text, not because her role was insignificant, but because the sacred writings, like many ancient records, prioritized patriarchal lineage while allowing the contributions of women, especially those outside Israel's direct covenant line, to fade into the margins of history. Yet her legacy is undeniable. She was the vessel through which African dynasties were born, the first matriarch of black civilization in the post-Diluvian world, and the silent architect behind sons who would become kings, warriors, priests, and founders of nations. It was she who nurtured the bloodline that would one day give rise to Ethiopia's royal houses, to Egypt's pharaohs, to Libya's ancient warriors, and to Canaan's cities and fortresses. It was she who carried forward the human story after the flood, not only through biology but through culture, memory, and tradition. Though the Bible does not name her, the evidence of her existence is written in the civilizations that followed. She is not simply the wife of Ham, she is the first mother of the African people. She is the root from which African heritage emerged in sacred history. Her body became the passage through which Africa entered the New World, and her descendants became the bearers of brilliance, resilience, and divine image. To understand Ham's legacy is to acknowledge that it did not begin with his sons alone, but with the woman who bore them. The unnamed wife of Ham is the foundational mother of a vast continent's peoples, and though the text is silent, history bears witness to the fruit of her hidden labor. She was not forgotten by heaven, even if forgotten by men. She was not secondary to Ham's calling, she was essential to it. In every lineage of Cush and Mizraim, in every ancient African throne and tribal memory, her blood flowed, and in that truth her dignity is restored. She is the mother of nations, she is the beginning of black civilization. She is, in every sense, Ham's wife, the mother of the African people. The biblical text offers no name, no description, and no genealogy for the woman who stood beside Ham as he stepped into the new world after the flood. Her silence is not a mere oversight in Scripture. It is a reflection of a broader historical pattern in which women, especially those outside the primary covenantal line, were frequently left unnamed despite their foundational roles. The absence of Ham's wife in the Genesis narrative has provoked centuries of inquiry, giving rise to both theological speculation and cultural remembrance. One of the oldest theories surrounding her identity is found in Jewish rabbinic literature, where some traditions identify her as Naamah, the daughter of Lamech and Zillah, and a descendant of Cain. Naamah is briefly mentioned in Genesis chapter 4 verse 22, known in rabbinic tradition for her beauty and her association with music or craftsmanship, traits that resonate with the rich artistic and cultural legacy found in early African civilization. If Ham's wife was indeed Naamah, then her union with Ham would represent the intertwining of two great but divergent lines, the line of Noah, preserved through righteousness and obedience, and the line of Cain, marked by exile, ingenuity, and divine judgment. Such a convergence would carry symbolic weight, as it would bind themes of justice and mercy, exile and redemption within a single bloodline. Their children, Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan, would then carry both the divine grace that preserved humanity and the ancestral memory of mankind's earliest transgression, forming a lineage uniquely acquainted with both survival and consequence. Another theory held by various African scholars and oral traditions suggests that Ham's wife may have been a native African woman, possibly from among a population spared or preserved through the flood's judgment, or one chosen by providence from a region near the ark's final resting place. In this view, her identity is not bound to Cain's line or pre-flood genealogy, but to Africa itself, a woman of deep ancestral heritage, whose union with Ham was divinely orchestrated to birth the nations that would later flourish under the sun of the continent. Her children, marked by her features and culture, would carry not only biological inheritance but a spiritual and geographical destiny to inhabit the lands of Cush, Egypt, Libya, and Canaan. This interpretation reframes her anonymity not as a sign of insignificance, but as the result of cultural and theological marginalization, a suppression of Africa's sacred matriarch in the very text that reveals her legacy. While neither theory is explicitly confirmed in Scripture, they converge upon a deeper truth. Ham's wife was a woman of profound purpose, essential to the formation of entire civilizations. The omission of her name reflects more than a literary choice. It mirrors a long-standing neglect of women's roles in sacred history, particularly women associated with Africa's foundational identity. Her erasure from the narrative has consequences, not only for biblical interpretation, but for how generations have viewed the value and dignity of African ancestry. Yet her legacy endures. She remains the mother of the first post-flood African lineage. Through her body flowed the future of empires. Through her silence in scripture, the question of her identity has become a powerful reminder of the cost of omission and the need to reclaim what was lost. She was not merely Ham's companion, she was the mother of kings, the bearer of nations, and the silent cornerstone of a continent's divine inheritance. The silence surrounding the identity of Ham's wife, though subtle in scripture, became a powerful instrument of distortion in the hands of history. Over time, what was once a textual omission evolved into a theological void, and into that void entered centuries of prejudice, fabrication, and injustice. The misreading of Genesis chapter 9 verse 20 to 27, where Noah pronounces a curse not upon Ham, but upon Canaan, his grandson, became the seed of a destructive ideology. In the hands of slave traders, colonial theologians, and oppressive regimes, this curse was wrongly extended to Ham himself, and further still to all his descendants, particularly those of African heritage. From this misinterpretation emerged the false doctrine known as the Curse of Ham, a belief system that claimed black people were divinely condemned to servitude and subjugation. This theological error was not rooted in scripture but in the racial biases and imperial ambitions of those who sought to justify slavery, segregation, and the dehumanization of African people. The biblical text, in truth, never declares Ham cursed. It never mentions skin color, never ties melanin to divine wrath, and never speaks of Africa as a land of shame. The curse, as recorded, was placed upon Canaan, and its implications were regional and limited in scope, not racial or eternal. Yet the lie endured. From pulpits to textbooks, from colonial courts to theological commentaries, the distortion of scripture was repeated until it hardened into doctrine. Ham was wrongly condemned, and his descendants falsely marked as inferior, casting a long shadow over African identity for centuries. And within this framework of erasure, Ham's wife was doubly silenced. Her anonymity in scripture became compounded by historical design, buried beneath layers of racial theology, imperial propaganda, and cultural amnesia. Her erasure was not accidental, it was strategic. By removing the mother of African nations from memory, oppressive systems stripped Africa of its divine matriarch, its rightful place in sacred history, and its God-ordained inheritance of dignity. But her legacy endured, not in text, but in civilization itself. Through Cush, she became the grandmother of the mighty kingdom of Nubia, the land of Cush, whose kings and queens rivaled Egypt in wealth and military power, and whose people built pyramids even before the pharaohs. Through Mizraim, she became the mother of ancient Egypt, a civilization that stands at the pinnacle of human achievement, contributing mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, and religious thought to the foundations of the modern world. Through Phut, she gave rise to the tribes of North Africa, who played significant roles in Mediterranean history, from Carthaginian expansion to early Christian theology. And through Canaan, despite the stain of Noah's curse, she was connected to the lands that would later become centers of biblical history, from the Phoenicians to the Jebusites, whose cities dotted the Levantine corridor. Far from being a marginal or mythic figure, Ham's wife was the wellspring of multiple civilizations, each bearing witness to her silent strength. She was the matriarch at the edge of scripture and the center of cultural genesis. Her omission from the biblical text should not be taken as a dismissal of her worth, but rather as an invitation to remember and restore what was unjustly forgotten. Her legacy is not one of shame, but of origin, not of subjugation, but of sovereignty. Her blood runs through the empires of Black Africa, through the scholars of ancient libraries, and through the warriors, queens, and builders of lands that stood proud long before Europe cast its gaze upon them. She was the first mother of African civilization in the post-flood world. Her name may be lost to us, but her impact remains undeniable. She is not a footnote in sacred history, she is a cornerstone. She is Ham's wife, the mother of the African people. Though the scriptures do not speak her name, the legacy of Ham's wife remains inscribed in the living history of nations. She was present aboard the ark when the world as it had been perished beneath the floodwaters. She emerged from that vessel not merely as a survivor, but as a vessel of destiny, carrying within her the bloodline that would become the heart of African civilization. In her womb was the promise of continuity. In her arms, she held the infancy of empires. She mothered the founders of empires, not in title alone, but in sacrifice, nurture, and guidance. It was she who nourished the children who would become the patriarchs of civilizations that left indelible marks upon the ancient world. Though the biblical record is silent, her footsteps echo in every region where her sons settled. She walked the banks of rivers that would one day irrigate kingdoms and cradle the wisdom of rising civilizations. She labored in the shadows while the names of men filled scrolls and stone tablets. She lived outside the gaze of scribes, but not outside the gaze of heaven. Her silence in the text is not proof of her insignificance. It is a mirror held up to a wider historical habit. Just as Africa's foundational role in human history has often been overlooked or diminished by colonial narratives, so too has the voice of its earliest mother been erased from theological memory. The omission of Ham's wife from Scripture is part of a larger pattern, the same pattern that silenced black women across generations, reduced their impact to anonymity, and hid their strength beneath the achievements of the sons they bore. Yet, even in silence, her legacy endured. Her story lived on through oral traditions, cultural memory, and the very survival of African identity in the face of centuries of erasure. Her spirit was preserved in the rhythms of African storytelling, in the intricate patterns of tribal art, in the reverence for maternal lineage that defines many African societies. Her descendants, the peoples of Ethiopia, Egypt, Libya, and Canaan, built monuments not only of stone, but of memory, encoding their ancestry in rituals, languages, and sacred symbols. She was never absent. She was never insignificant. She was only unacknowledged by the hands that recorded the names of kings but forgot the women who birthed them. Today, her memory stirs again, not through newly discovered texts or inscriptions, but through the reawakening of truth in the hearts of those who seek to restore what history forgot. In every black mother who endures, in every African daughter who rises, in every scholar and artist who reclaims the past with dignity, her reflection shines. She was the first African matriarch after the flood, the silent strength behind the builders of nations, and the origin point of a people whose resilience testifies to her enduring influence. She is not a myth. She is not a metaphor. She is Ham's wife, the mother of the African people. To speak of Ham's wife is to bring to light the story of every woman whose name was buried beneath the sands of time, while the names of their sons became the pillars of kingdoms. It is to unearth the forgotten foundation of nations, to reframe the beginning of Africa's history not as one of bondage or brokenness, but as one rooted in divine selection, sacred labor, and maternal strength. Long before the first chains were cast upon African soil, before colonial powers drew false lines through her lands and her people, Africa stood tall, carried on the shoulders of empires whose beginnings can be traced back to a woman unnamed, yet not unknown. The legacy of Ham's wife predates the wounds of slavery and the scars of oppression. Her story begins with survival through the flood, with the birth of sons who would shape the ancient world, and with a womb that bore the image of God into lands bathed in sunlight and crowned with wisdom. She must no longer be seen as a marginal figure in sacred history, but as a cornerstone of it. Her silence in the text is not a dismissal of her worth, but a reflection of historical patterns that denied visibility to the women who bore the weight of human continuity. Her life was not a mere backdrop to Ham's legacy, it was the soil from which that legacy grew. To remember Ham's wife is to challenge the narrative that Africa's place in biblical history is secondary. It is to restore honor to a forgotten mother whose children spread across continents and carved their names into the legacy of mankind. It is to declare that her absence from the written word does not diminish her presence in the unfolding of human civilization. She is not a footnote in theology, nor a mysterious shadow to be dismissed by scholarship. She is the first matriarch of post-flood Africa. She is the sacred thread through which Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan entered the world. She is the beginning of African heritage and the silent strength behind its earliest glories. Her memory demands restoration, not merely as a gesture of inclusion, but as a matter of truth. In doing so, we do not rewrite Scripture but reclaim the fullness of its implications. We recognize that to honor her is to honor the unspoken dignity of black motherhood across centuries, the mothers whose labor birthed kings, prophets, and poets, yet whose names were never etched in stone. She was not cursed. Scripture never placed judgment upon her. She was not forsaken. Her children built kingdoms. She was not forgotten by heaven. She was chosen. Her name may not appear in Scripture, but her legacy is carved into the foundations of nations. She was there when humanity began again. She bore the patriarchs of African civilization. She watched as her sons built cities, raised temples, and carried the image of God into the lands of Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. Her silence in the biblical text is not a sign of absence, but a reflection of how history has often treated the women who shaped it, especially those whose skin bore the sun and whose strength birthed continents. If this story has awakened something within you, if it has challenged the silence, corrected the distortion, or restored a piece of truth, then I invite you to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the hidden legacies of Scripture. And please share this video with others so the story of Ham's wife can rise once more, out of silence and into light. Thank you for watching, for remembering, and for joining in the restoration of truth. Your presence makes a difference. This is her legacy. This is her restoration. This is Ham's wife, the mother of the African people.